Welcome, everyone. I'm Adrian PerezMelgoza, the director of the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook, and it's really my dear and pleasure to welcome this event today, which I think is really key and necessary to hold as we start a semester in which critical race theory is in the discussion in the public media. And I think we're going to gain really good perspectives about how to position it in a real and rational way within the discourse of race and today's new enhanced efforts to end racism that we are all, or I think we're all wanting to contribute to. So as director of the Institute, I welcome you all, and I welcome especially Tracey Walters, who has been key organizer of this event. And let me just tell you a couple of things. Pleasure to introduce Professor Tracey Walters, who will coordinate and moderate the rest of the event. And she has also been, as I said before, the key organizer and spirit behind having all of us together here today. Tracey Walters is Professor of Literature in the Department of Africana Studies at Stony Brook University. And she also holds an affiliate appointment with the Departments of English and Women and Gender Studies. Professor Walters' research focuses on African American women's literature and Black British literature and African diasporic women's literature. She has published numerous articles and books, including African American Women and the Classicist Tradition, from Black women writers from Whitley to Morrison. She has an edited collection on Sadie Smith's critical essays, and also an ebook entitled Sadie Smith, which is for the today's writers and their work series. She has more recently published Not Your Mother's Money, The Representation of Domestic in Transatlantic Media. And finally, last year, she published, not finally, she will publish more, but the latest book is Sadie Smith Decoded. In fall 2013, Dr. Walters received the Outstanding Faculty Member Award from the Stony Brook chapter of the NAACP, and she's currently directing and spearheading an initiative called Knowledge for Freedom, which will be a way of bringing high school students in contact with the research in the humanities and key issues in the humanities during the summer at Stony Brook University. Also, in a more close to the Institute note, Tracey Walters has been a key contributor to the work of the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook for many years. She has been a member of the board, and she is also a dear component of many of our programs. And I really welcome you, Tracey, and I'm looking forward to the event. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian Ungar, who also worked very closely with me on this. And thank you to all of the panelists who agreed to do this when we interrupted their summer holidays and requested their participation. So thank you. And thank you to all who've joined us on the Zoom. So this is thrilling. I'm so excited that we could pull this event together. And I hope that this is the first of many conversations to come, right? So just to kind of echo what Adrian said earlier, this conversation today came about in light of the current political climate, the attacks on CRT and intersectionality, efforts to stop anti-racist education, and just so much misinformation. And so I thought it was important to have a conversation, a discussion with faculty who teach on race and systemic oppression and racial inequalities. And I'm hoping today that they will share with us their strategies for teaching. So we are going to turn your attention to a brief video because I think it's important to make the distinction between critical race theory and teaching about race and racism.
Let's just start with a basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other, that there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. That's a theoretical framework. I think what we're talking about today, though, is some contestation and conflict over how you teach about race, racial hierarchies, critically, racism in schools and society. And so the two are being conflated.
And so when you hear people talking repeatedly about critical race theory, what is your thought?
Well, I hear people talking about critical race theory. I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological, in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society. So, you know, there are a number of, I read a really good article just yesterday in the New Yorker about the origins of this conflict and who's behind it. And it's a concerted effort by many on the right to mitigate the extent to which we really augment and increase the understanding of racism in our society.
Okay, all right, so now that we have that definition clear, we will proceed. So I'm going to go ahead and read out the bios of our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and read the bios of our panelists, and then we shall proceed. So first we have Dr. Andrew Flescher, who is Professor of Family, Population and Preventative Medicine and Professor of English, where he is also core faculty in the program in public health. He specializes in medical humanities, areas related to the interface between ethics and literature, healthcare policy, organ donation policy, public health, and medical and bioethics. Following Dr. Flescher, we will have Dr. Laurie Flores, who is Associate Professor of History at Stony Brook. Her research and writing focuses on Latinx life, labor, and politics in the US from the post-World War II era to the present day. She is the co-editor of the new completely revised edition of The Academic's Handbook, which contains essays about navigating academia from a diverse array of scholars across disciplines and career stages. Dr. George Fouron is Professor of Education and Social Sciences in the Africana Studies Department. His research focuses on transnationalism and its effects as experienced by Haitians in Haiti and those of the Haitian diaspora. His latest manuscript, Haiti's Migratory Streams at the Crossroads of Global Capitalism and the Politics of Competing Empires, is under review currently by Penn State Press. Next, we have Professor Gary Marr, who's Professor in Philosophy. His area of specializations include logic history of analytic philosophy, Asian American philosophy, and philosophy of religion. He is the founding director of the Philosophy Department Logic Lab and founding director of Stony Brook University's Asian American Center Bridge, which was a catalyst for Stony Brook University's Charles B. Wang Asian American Center. He is currently serving on CAPRA, Committee on Academic Priorities and Research Activities, and is a commissioner of the Suffolk County Human Rights Commission, chairing its Education Committee. And finally, we have Dr. Adrian Wallace, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Africana Studies with additional affiliations in the Department of Political Science and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her first book project explores how Muslim women in Nigeria and Ghana use their civil society organizations and activism to reshape the norms around women's political and economic participation. The second project focuses on regional economic integration in Africa and gender equality. Thank you to our panelists. So without further ado, we will start with Professor Flescher.
Thank you so much, Tracey. Thank you for including me in this. I'm really honored to be here. And you can also hear I've had a difficult time teaching through a mask, so I apologize for my rough voice. I wrote these remarks out formally in case Tracey had to read them for me. So I just want to mention 7 things that I try to do, and I'm always learning. The first is to listen as much as possible to people who come from a different place than I do. Let folks speak to the extent that is possible, draw relevance of their experience to the assigned readings. If the readings don't resonate, give them a chance to explain why. Always be open to revisions in the curriculum for following years, so next year's students can be the beneficiaries of this feedback. And always, whether they find it relatable or not, listen as much as possible to students who come from diverse backgrounds when they open up and link the curriculum to their own experience. Second thing I try to do is make sure that the readings are inclusive. Now, this idea of there being a canon of literature versus contemporary alternative works which emphasize race, I find to be a false dichotomy. There are all sorts of ways to give many genres voices. Schools have thought they're due. And to the extent to which one can choose to read something new and be a student in one's own class, that's a good thing. Also, always get out of your comfort zone. The third thing I'd say, and here I just want to elaborate a touch, is to teach in a way so as to acknowledge that racism comes in many forms, including institutional forms. A couple examples of this I'd like to take from a course I teach called Contemporary Issues in Public Health. So this class, among other things, introduces students to the notion of health disparities, not just that they exist, but why they came to be. Here, an instructive example occurs with regard to Robert Moses, who made, as many of us know, highways in Long Island, which would guarantee the economic discrimination against people of color over time. Under a specious justification based on eminent domain, Moses raised primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods in order to create parks, building parkways right through the heart of these minority neighborhoods, linking New York City to beaches and other outdoor attractions along Long Island in such a way that those parkways were too low for buses from the inner city to access these destination points. This led over time predictably to segregated neighborhoods, segregation with respect to public resources, and most damagingly, perhaps, the eventual outcome of homes and neighborhoods being valued differently, seriously affecting the financial well-being of communities of color versus white communities, which in turn would have still greater ramifications. So teaching race in the classroom simply didactically in a way that calls attention to dates and facts can't provide the necessary comprehensive account of this form of institutional discrimination. And my second example from public health has to do with the Affordable Health Care Act, which I discuss with my students in the same class. Besides equating them with the historical details and economic impetus for the legislation leading up to its enactment in 2010, we examine the legitimacy of various proffered ethical arguments for and against considering universal health care as a right, which is something, by the way, the Affordable Health Care Act doesn't even quite do. If healthcare is a right, we must determine, as other countries have, how to ensure and pay for it. One of the biggest objections to a single payer in the literature is not a straightforward budgetary one, but rather one raised on the grounds of libertarianism, customarily invoked to argue that there is no natural right to that which another possesses. Now, what I find interesting about this objection is not the debates internal to the natural law tradition about how rights and responsibilities should be understood, but rather that this objection surfaces here in America to an enormously higher degree than it does in Europe. It is not that Americans don't want to pool their resources as such to a greater degree than others. It is when one delves a bit that we don't want to pay for the other from a different tribe, race, or ethnicity, something we might have spared from having to do in a more homogeneous environment. In other words, race has everything in the world to do with American resistance to adopting an attitude of all being in it together, a mantra, I'd argue, which must be adopted if we're to have a humane and financially solvent healthcare system and not merely a healthcare industry, a distinction my colleague Norm Edelman is want to make. Our resistance in this country in the name of libertarianism, or worse, in the name of freedom, to universal coverage is something which I'd argue is institutionally racist. As I told Tracey, I'm no expert, but it seems to me that both of these examples call attention to how critical race theory can help to illuminate how over time racist systems and institutions are created, sometimes impactfully, but unintentionally, and other times both impactfully and intentionally. My view is we need something that goes beyond ad hoc superficial treatment of racism, and critical race theory, crafted inclusively, has the potential to be just this approach. Just 4 more bullet points very, very quickly. Give latitude with limits. Create a safe space in your class for difficult issues to be discussed, even those occupying a non-popular view, but don't allow just anything. I don't allow anti-vax folks in my public health courses to have a soapbox on which to advertise their views, and I don't allow sweeping generalizations about race in the name of free speech. Next, aspire for the diversity of authorial voice. I said earlier, not just diversify readings, but diversify who comes in to give guest lectures and in your references to popular culture. Second to last, exercise humility. Realize just how easy it is to go off the rails. On the one hand, nobody wants to be a hall monitor or put a hall monitor in their head. On the other, if one isn't careful, one will be bound to offend. So how does one engage in respectful discourse? This is an art. Tone of voice is critical. Be deferential without patronizing. Think of oneself always as someone who hasn't seen all the angles, that you could be missing something. Finally, just like you would be opportunistic in the class to be diverse, outside of the class, avail yourself as many opportunities as you can to spend time with people who don't come from the same place that you do, and bring that into the classroom. Thank you again so much, Tracey and colleagues. And again, I'm sorry for having had you suffer through that voice.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and you sounded just great. So we're gonna turn now to Professor Flores.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out for this event today. I am speaking from the historian's point of view. One thing that I have definitely noticed is happening with the critical race theory conversation and contentious debate out there is that even the abbreviation of it, the shortening of the phrase and the field of scholarship to such a pithy 3-letter thing, it condenses it so much that people are using this abbreviation now in buzzwords with very little idea of the really dense and thoughtful and extensive field of scholarship in legal history and in other disciplines that this phrase originates from. And this idea that critical race theory is activism not based in any intellectualism is totally false. And I think the array of scholars that we have here tonight just goes to show how many disciplines really do use very much critical race theory as a foundational aspect of the kinds of analyses they encourage their students to use. So in the discipline of history, like was said in the video that was shown at the beginning, the law is not and has never been a neutral thing. Lawyers and judges and juries are made up of people with individual backgrounds, individual prejudices, and the fact that the law is constructed by people means that laws are going to be put in place and still are in place that have been impacted by people's ideas of racial difference, by people's motivations to institute discriminatory treatment. It's just a historical reality, and history, along with many other disciplines, is about the study of human behavior. Why do people make the decisions that they make? How do they impact other people in the process? Why would we want to completely erase the study of how people make decisions, separate themselves into categories, enact divisions in this wide variety of ways that codify separation in law and in government and in medicine, like Andrew was saying, in other spheres? of public life. We need to study the effects of how racism and racial ideologies have motivated certain enactments and continuations of inequalities that we see continuing on to this day. If we are not examining race critically and using it as an axis of analysis, we can't extricate it out from the other things that we might be studying, like gender, like age, religion, able-bodiedness, political ideology, class, all of these other things that we are making a part of the way that we analyze our world and the past. We have to trace race back to, and racism, and the ways in which these things have come to evolve. If we're not willing to have a history that reckons with race, it's not complete history. It's incomplete and uninformed and inaccurate. Along the vein of, examining institutions and inequalities today, whether it's housing or whether it's how immigration legislation has come about, or a panel we had last year about anti-Asian violence during the time of COVID, the long history of how diseases have been racialized over time and how that has impacted laws and policies and the exclusion and marginalization of people. If we're examining all of that, and if we let go of critical race theory as a foundation upon which we teach the past, we're also getting rid of the analysis of how whiteness, for that matter, has been constructed as a racial category in this nation and in the world, who has been included and excluded from that category over time. Whiteness, just like any other racial identity, is not a blank slate. It's constructed by humans and exerted upon humans. So then we lose interrogation of that too. So for me, critical race theory is really essential to teaching a history that is honest, and it's about acknowledging a body of historical scholarship that has existed for a long time and is still evolving. History needs to take into account the discoveries that we make over time, the people whose stories we unearth that weren't there before. And so I find the attacks on critical race theory really distracting. They're really derailing, and they can be confusing for people, because then it starts to pivot to teachers being accused of spreading harmful things in the classroom, sowing seeds of division rather than conversation. And we can talk about teaching methods in a little bit and compare our strategies. But for me, the way I approach things in my classroom is recognizing that, this is college. This is a time of learning how to articulate your ideas and wrestle with confusion you might have had and learn from your peers. And so I think it's really essential. And one of the foundational tenets of critical race theory is to have those hard conversations, to reckon with difficult things. And I think, like Andrew said, creating a safe space in the classroom to do that, I think is essential, and realizing that people can be young during this time and are allowed to be young and change their minds and articulate their ideas in a place that they feel supported in working through ideas and debates with their peers. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you so much. And yeah, good point about the abbreviation. And we will turn our attention to Dr. Fouron, who pretty much takes great delight in these kinds of debates in the classroom, as any former student will tell you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this forum. From my perspective, I will take a different approach to the event. The first thing that we need to realize as educators at universities and higher learning situations is that there is a disconnect between what we do and what the public schools in our society do. We receive our students from the public schools, and we know that public education in general is very conservative. The curriculums that exist in most schools are not really challenging enough to prepare the students to become critical thinkers. What they try to do is to create a standardized citizenry through the manufacturing of consent. So therefore, the content of the curriculum is very conservative. So the students come to us having trained to adhere to the norms and characteristics of American society. And if we were to read the Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, we realize from the get-go that the textbooks that our students use at the grade level and the true reality of American societies are totally disconnected. So there are many omissions and there are many half-truths and there are outright lies in the curriculums of the public schools that are the feeders for classrooms. So the problem is, what do we do with these students when they come to us? I myself am a student of Dewey, who believes that critical inquiry is of utmost importance. And I agree with Andrew that the voices of the students in the classroom are of primary importance. That is why I begin off my classes with a mantra. I ask them from the previous lesson, from previous lectures we had, if they have anything to challenge, anything to question. And I end up by telling them, this is the forum. They have a voice. I want to hear that voice. And we all need to respect that voice. So Dewey tells us that as we educate our citizenry, we need to prepare them to be critical thinkers. But our society does not support critical thinking. And I have some examples to give you to put it in perspective, the kind of things I'm saying here. When the nation was young, it did not set up a national system of education for the citizenry of this country. But at the same time, it promoted what Kissinger and all call diminished inquisitiveness. We don't encourage our grade school students to be critical thinkers, to be curious, to ask questions. And of course, it's not the fault of our students, and it is not the fault of the teachers who are teaching them, because they are under tyranny of standardized testing. Standardized testing is the enemy of education, It is the enemy of freedom of thoughts in our society, because the answers to the standardized tests are preordained. The students who take these tests are not allowed to challenge. These are the questions or the answers to the questions. So they are taught to toe the line and to accept whatever the textbooks told them, whatever the teachers told them, and whatever the curriculum that they are being educated through tells them. So now they come to us, and we want to, in a way, open up the world to them and to make them critical inquirers. And now the problem of CRT, critical race theory, is that there is a fear in this country. And it's not particular to America, it's all around the world. Because the powers that be in most societies are afraid of critical inquirers. They are afraid that if the citizenry is truly educated, has the wherewithal to question what they are doing as leaders of their nations, they will be in jeopardy in their positions. So therefore, they tailor the curriculums of the schools in such a way when the students are lashed out, are released, after being graduated, they will adhere to the mantra and they will adhere to the philosophies of these political systems that control education. And of course, in America, we are in a very peculiar situation in the sense that we have 50 different states of education throughout the nation. We have very liberal school districts. We have very conservative school districts. So critical race theory frightens people. They don't want the truth to come out. They don't want these students to be enlightened. They don't want them to know the true realities of our society, from the legal system to the economic system to the political and social system. And our job as educators is not to indoctrinate our students. I'm totally against it. I'm totally against telling the students what to think, but I'm for presenting the truth to them and encourage them to evaluate, to probe, to question, to research further whatever we are presenting to them in the classroom. And I think that the strength of American democracy will come out of an enlightened citizenry that knows the true realities of this country and will not repeat the mistakes of the past. So when they say critical race theory is anti-white, they are manufacturing a crisis that doesn't exist. And we need to know, as educators at an institution of higher learning, at a research institution of great reputation, that we have a significant mission. And the mission is to show the students the true realities of our society. But at the same time, we respect them when they challenge our presentations and when they challenge the truth that we present to them, because we are not the final end of all this truism that we teach in our classrooms. And I hope through my years in education, I would have touched a few students who understood the kind of democracy they are living in, and as Dewey told us, to make a commitment to change the society for the better for all. Thank you.
Sounds like George is running for president. All right, thank you, Professor Fouron. And next we'll turn it to Professor Moore.
Okay, I'm a philosopher, and I do want to apologize like Andy did, because I didn't have time to write out some remarks, but I did have time to critically listen to what people have to say, and I have a few comments that I'd like to make, because I want to get to the questions, because I think when human beings are asking questions, that's when they're being most human and most interesting and most engaged. Tracey's book was something like Knowledge About Freedom, and I think that's a beautiful idea. There are different kinds of knowledge. There's kind of the theoretical knowledge like critical race theory. There's practical knowledge like how to intervene and stop a racist incident. But there's also narrative knowledge that happens when you teach students and you let them think and to express in a safe environment, as Andy talked about, issues about race. Because what we're actually asking to do is asking students to evaluate assumptions that they may have built their lives upon and to think about it critically and maybe change. And that's not going to happen when people are going to be debating at an intellectual level whether CRT is this or that, because that's only 10% of the brain. There's the other part of the lived experience where people experience contradictions. Asians, for example, are often asked, "Where are you from?" And so it's like, why do people say that? What's the source of that? Or when I was a young child, people say, "Are you Chinese or Japanese?" Like, where did that question come from? Well, you don't understand that until you see how your life fits into history. And so Professor Flores mentioned that whiteness studies and criticism of whiteness studies is an important part. And an image that I have helped to keep in my mind with students is to imagine a white light being projected through a critical prism of critical thinking. What happens? You see a rainbow of colors that come out on the end. And that's because what we were taught that history was is really multicultural, and it's had all of these different aspects all the way from the beginning. The book that George mentioned, Lies My Teacher Taught Me by James Lowen, is a wonderful critique of history books. It's got a lot of humor and so forth, but one of his first books was about Louisiana and the Chinese and the Louisiana South, and he was doing sort of a analysis of why coolie labor was not able to replace enslaved labor after slavery was abolished in the United States. But then he learned how to write these other books, like that book, and Lies Across the Country, and Signs Across the Country, and Lies Across the Country. Beautiful, interesting books. He has an epigraph in the beginning, if I recall. Those who forget history are condemned to repeat 12th grade. So, because history is one of these topics that, you know, when history professors get students, they say, look, forget everything you knew in high school because it's all wrong. Right? A lot of minorities don't like to learn history in high school because it's all about minorities being victimized and what this happened, and the idea of the empowerment and the agency of minorities is often missing. I learned this from a filmmaker, Lonnie Ding, who taught me that what you want to show is to eliminate that. You know, Asians have been stereotyped as perpetual foreigners. That's why you get this, you know, where do you come from? They've been stereotyped as, you know, silent, resigned victims. And they have been stereotyped as model minorities more recently. But what she said to do is, you don't oppose these stereotypes because that only reinforces them, but you show the opposite. So in her beautiful films, the only in-depth series in America on Asians in the Americas, she does that. She shows the opposite. And the most powerful thing I've done with my students is to make films and documentaries. And we dedicated our work to Lonnie, and she came to Stony Brook and helped my students learn how to do filmmaking. She's known as the godmother of all ethnic filmmaking in the US because of her powerful classes at Berkeley. And so anyway, what Lonnie did was that she showed my students how to make knowledge. It's not just learning knowledge or learning theory, but that to realize that their own experiences count as knowledge, and by analyzing that, they can have freedom. When they see themselves in that history and that history makes sense out of these contradictions that they experience, they become whole. And they become students who can teach other students how to have those conversations. One of my students, Maddie, said, you know, she said, just come back, critical race theory. She says, you know, when the conversation stops, that's when the other side wins. So maybe I'll just conclude with this. Martin Luther King, in Letter to a Birmingham Jail, wrote this, which I think is a good way of thinking about how to teach race. You know, Martin Luther King was a philosopher. He wrote his PhD on Gandhi. But this is what he said in that letter. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a kind of constructive tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from bondage of myths and half-truths, we must see that having non-violent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men and women to rise from dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. These we have to remember, if we're asking students to do this work, we have to do it ourselves. Some of the people that can talk good theory are still racist in ways they treat their colleagues and in the ways they think they treat their students. And unless we do that hard work and create that environment where students are asked to do that hard work, I think we won't really be able to have the kind of change that we want to see.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. And finally, and joyfully, we have Professor Wallace.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely excited to be a part of this panel, especially at the beginning of the semester. So hopefully a lot of these conversations we're having today will have an impact on the way that we continue to teach, right? Especially under these conditions with the pandemic. So when I think about the ways in which I utilize critical race theory frameworks in my own teaching, one of the key things that I try to prioritize is illustrating for students the ways in which institutions can increase and perpetuate inequalities, right? And when we're talking about institutions, I'm talking about referencing not only political institutions, but also economic institutions and social institutions, and that includes cultural and religious structures as well, right? One of the things that I think it's very important that we underscore for the students is that these institutional inequalities that are being created, they're not just occurring by happenstance, right? This is very much about power in different societies, about who has authority to construct the institutions themselves, who has the ability to support them, and then who makes decisions around resource allocation, right? And so if we keep kind of going back to that theme of inequality and also connecting that to power dynamics, then I think that it really allows students an opportunity to think comparatively about what the actual impacts of inequalities are on the ground. So for example, one of the first ways in which I try to drive this point home when I'm teaching gender, race, and HIV/AIDS in Black communities is by assigning Crenshaw's first piece, right, that actually looks at intersectionality frameworks. And so we read the case law, right, that she cites. And it's easy for students then, when we go through those three cases, right, Travenol, the Hughes Helicopter Company, and GM, it's easier for them to see how legal frameworks can actually erase different populations, right? Particularly in this context, Black women. And it helps to disrupt this idea that our legal systems are inherently unbiased and that they're objective, right? I then also highlight for the students that the same ways in which our legal system sometimes can reduce diverse populations down to very simple kind of homogenized groups and also distort the needs of those groups, that policy frameworks can do the same things, right? And so that also gives them an opportunity to think about the ways in which the social, racially constructed social categories that exist specifically in this case in the US context are then also translated into and can be translated into policy prescriptions, right, and interventions that take place that not only fail to address the needs of different groups that have been marginalized substantively, but they can also actually create additional harms. Right? So using critical race theory to help students see empirically what happens when bias remains unchecked, I think is a tool that really allows them to think about and reflect constantly even on their own decisions, right, and assumptions that they make about not just political engagement, but also conversations around health, around labor and work, right, and all of the other issues that we have to constantly grapple with, both in terms of the literature that we're reading in coursework, but then also, right, the practical implications of everyday lived experiences. The second thing that I want to signpost that's really important for critical race theory in terms of the ways in which we can make changes in our curriculum is in my graduate research methods seminar, right? So it's amazing how students will come in and have all of these assumptions about quantitative methods inherently being less biased or more objective than qualitative or interpretivist methods, right? And so it gives me an opportunity to talk with them about the way that we define terms and concepts, even if we're talking about doing in statistical analysis, just basic regressions, right? Just looking at the relationships between two variables. You know, if you're looking at political participation, for example, in Kenya or in the US, the way that you define politics matters because that determines what data you're actually counting and what kind of activity you're counting, right? The way that you're operationalizing these terms makes a difference. And then that in and of itself can impact whether or not you determine that your theoretical explanation for a political phenomenon or an activity is valid or whether it needs to be rejected. So helping students understand that internally as researchers and scholars, we are making choices and that those choices have power and that as an academic, you have a certain amount of authority that's given to you when you start trying to explain different outcomes, that you have to be very responsible and reflexive about your own bias as a researcher so that you're not recreating that through your own scholarship production efforts. The third thing that I'll just mention is that critical race theory centers the experiences specifically of Black women in the United States, right? But the broader and kind of more abstract components of critical race theory, again, focus on institutional variations, right? And institutional bias, right? And so it's helpful to, and one of the other things I do in my courses is to put these issues of inequality in comparative context. So looking at cases not just from the US, but of course from other countries, and typically because Africa is a region where I have expertise, looking at the ways in which those same institutional structures will produce inequalities, but in different ways against different populations, right? And so that helps students understand that social constructions of race exist, but you can also politicize other identity categories, right? And that's really, really important, because you want to make sure that students aren't taking the racial constructs or the societal constructs in the US and then superimposing them in other countries, right? So it actually forces them to understand the historical context in other nations. It also helps them to examine the ways in which different definitions of demographic categories have been constructed by the state and then deployed to advantage particular political administrations or agendas, right? The last thing that I will mention is for us as professors to think very critically about our syllabi. And when we are teaching, right? And so like this semester, for example, I'm teaching Women, Islam, and Political Change in Africa. I make sure that not only do I include scholarship by African Muslim feminists throughout the semester, but that I also include diverse perspectives of African Muslim feminists, right? Because one of the other things that we want to avoid doing is, quote, adding in scholars that are BIPOC or scholars of African descent, but then still treating groups as if they're monolithic, right? As if there's only one perspective, one analysis. And instead you want to actually show the debates, right, within academics for, in particular, within particular literatures, right? The second thing that I think is really important, again, when we look at our syllabi, is to not only, so for example, again, with my Women, Islam, and Political Change in Africa course, it's about, you know, African feminists that identify as Muslim predominantly, right? So in that sense, I have a lot of resources from my own field work that I'm able to incorporate. But I don't just include those scholars, you know, when I'm referencing different types of feminist debates. I also include them when in the readings about our basic foundational understandings of politics, right? Or political theory, right? Within the course materials. And that's important because when you mainstream the work of scholars from, you know, BIPOC scholars or scholars from different backgrounds, different national contexts, and you actually mainstream them into the theoretical foundations that you're trying to establish for your students, depending on the subject matter, it illustrates to them both symbolically and substantively that you don't only introduce diverse perspectives when you're quote unquote talking about diversity, right? If you're actually going to mainstream it, they should be foundational pieces, right? You should write or include those works in the canon itself and transform them. And then you would be surprised, you know, sometimes in courses I've had students, you know, start following the scholarship produced by particular feminists, right? Or, you know, political theorists. And so it actually introduces them into a new body of work. And then they will take that information and knowledge with them into other courses, right? They can continue to introduce it, and, you know, students talk to each other, which surprises us not at all, of course. But, you know, they also then start to introduce those same concepts and, you know, kind of their own ideas about what could be incorporated into the canon with their colleagues as well. And all of those things are helpful, especially in terms of kind of back channeling. But I'm happy to end my remarks here, just so we have more time for Q&A, because that's the really critical part of this program. And I thank you all for listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you. And thank you to the panelists. So there's been a lot of overlap, and you'll notice that our panelists come from a range of disciplines, and that was important to us when we put together the panel. But some of the things that kind of pop out are that it's important to train critical thinkers, that we must create safe spaces for our students, we must empower our students to allow them to have a voice in the classroom, to diversify our curriculum, and ensure that there are a range of perspectives that are brought into the classroom, As the historian reminds us, teaching fact over fiction, to be accountable as scholars and as faculty, and recognizing that inequality and the dynamics between inequality and power dynamics. So I am sure there are many, many questions in our chat, and it's hard to believe that it's almost 7 o'clock. And so for our audience out there, feel free to start getting your questions prepared. And I guess I'll kick off unless there's anything in the chat. There's been a lot of really good thus far, some really good strategies and tools to use in the classroom, but I'll start with this one, and others may please join in the chat. So how do you get students to push through the uncomfortable silences that happen in class? There might be students who wish to participate, but for fear of offending, not having the right words, or actually feeling like they're the target audience. How do you get students then to generate a conversation where they can feel comfortable enough to participate? Anyone can jump in.
Okay, I'll take a jump in first, I guess. One of the things that I do is to actually give them an in-class exercise or even break them into small groups. And I'll ask them, and if I take the Gender, Race, and HIV, AIDS, and Black Communities course, I will ask them to, identify an HIV, AIDS intervention that you think is essential, and then, think about 3 objectives, right, within this within this program intervention, and then identify the target populations, right? That would be, kind of recipients of the program. And so part of what that at least does is it gives them a targeted focus. And so then they have debates within their small group activities about what should be the first priority. And inevitably that starts to force them to have conversations around privilege, around access, and they're bringing their own perspectives into that particular exercise. And so there are things that they might not consider because it might not be part of their lived experience. And then after the small groups are done, everybody reports back, and we kind of workshop each group's ideas so they get feedback from their colleagues. And then inevitably those questions around, again, like I mentioned before, privilege, but inequality, those same things that I'm trying to get them to talk about come out, but they've come out in a way that allows some students that might feel less comfortable speaking in class about these issues to have some cover because there's a group, right, that they're kind of presenting with. And then if everybody's workshopping these ideas and concepts, students tend to see it as less of a personal attack and more about critiquing the particular exercise, right, or the intervention. And so that's one strategy that I've tried to use to get people to participate and engage and still deal with those questions around power.
I just want to add, I love Adrian's idea of debates internal to a tradition and getting students to realize the risk of occupying positions with which they're not innately comfortable. So my term for that is non-no-brainer issues, or the beauty of non-rhetorical questions that when we ask them, we don't have a prepared answer in advance. And in forcing students safely to take the perspective of just that view with which they're default likely not to agree, and then move from there, with a significant caveat that certain things are disallowed. I haven't encountered these things in my classroom, but I can imagine certain forms of speech that I characterize as offensive action. So it's not an anything goes. I want to distinguish the point I think we're both making from anything goes, but I wholeheartedly support that idea of internal debates.
Yeah, going along with what both Adrian and Andrew have said, I think taking the time, if it's the night before, or if it's an hour before, a few minutes before, thinking of an exercise that can open up the room. I mean, for me, I think of it as something that gets them to think sort of along the lines of universality and then getting to specificity. So for instance, one of the most challenging classes that I had recently was teaching a class on the US-Mexico border. Because that brings up a lot of issues regarding ever-shifting legislation, territorial lines, the drug war, immigration, of course. And so there were a lot of people with positions all along the spectrum when it came to these issues. So I had a student who served in the Border Patrol for many years, and then I had a student whose mother crossed the border without papers, and she grew up with that life in New York, right? And so it was challenging for me to think of assignments that got us to enter a topic, but through doing something like free writing or either something individually or in pairs or groups, like was said before, to get them to think about something universal. So for instance, one class was about examining what migrant emotional history during the World War II period. And so I started the class by having I passed out blank postcards and I said, imagine you're writing a postcard to someone you love and miss. It can be anyone in your life, living or dead, and start with that. And by giving them a few minutes to write those postcards, it made them think about universal emotions, fear, anxiety, love, grief. And that was something that could connect them all. And then when we delved into the specificity of what would a Mexican migrant be feeling in the World War II period, they were able to better empathize with that historical subject because they could see that translation of emotion over time. So it's something that sort of gives some breathing room to students at first, I think has worked well for me in classes where I feel that there's a blockage of some sort.
Thank you. George, you want to weigh in, or Gary?
I'm sorry. I think what the two methods, having people in groups talk and as well as the blank postcards were combined in a very interesting way when I had Ebeth, who works for the Ellen Aldous Center for the Communication of Science. She was an improv teacher at some point, and she did community theater. And I met her and I asked her to come into my class when we were dealing with the issue of sexual assault. And she did something very creative, which I've never seen done and I think could be very useful. What she had was, he had students write some short sentences on pieces of paper and submit it to her. And then she created sort of a performance word piece based on what people said. And just by putting these, the students hearing their own words in juxtaposition without comment, was a very powerful experience. Some of them were not used, but just having students hear what other people in the class thought about this topic was very, very powerful.
Okay, thank you. George?
To repeat myself again, I am a student of Dewey's thoughts. And what he told us to do when we teach our classes is to make the students the center of our presentations. It is not about us. It is not about anybody else. It's about the students. So if you present the facts in such a way that they touch the student sensibility, and remember, in many, many cases, we are presenting information that the students would have heard for the first time in their lives, in their academic life. The high school, the grade school did not teach them these facts and this kind of information. So they are hearing them for the first time. Sometimes they are startled about the information you present to them. Sometimes they are incredulous about the information that you present to them. And sometimes they feel like they have a different perspective on the issues that you are dealing with, you are addressing in the classroom. So I try to use some shock therapy sometimes, put the students on the hot plate, so to speak, because it's about them. And I get them to respond to things and to ideas that I present to them. One of the things that I do is that every semester I will write my entire courses. And the students have access to my own notes that I post on Blackboard for them. So if they didn't read them while, I don't want them to take notes while I'm teaching. I want them to pay attention to what we are discussing so that they become engaged in the discussions and try to the best of my abilities to touch the sensibility so that you can get them to participate, to respond to the kind of things you are saying. And that's one of the strategies that I use.
Okay, great, thank you. So all of those strategies sound great, but there will always be students who are resistant. And there's a question in the chat here that addresses this, especially in light of what's happening this year. I mean, for some of us who teach on race and systems of oppression, we're accustomed to certain things that happen in classes, but for others, this is a different environment. So how can we, what kind of advice can you share and give to faculty who might be teaching on race for the first time, or maybe they've been teaching on race for a long time, but want to be prepared for any backlash, for any conflict that might arise in the classroom? Jump in.
That's a tough question. Just briefly, I'll say there's two parts to this. One is, in general, how does one deal with conflict? And that's general pedagogy. And maybe another HISB forum. But specifically with regard to race, it's tempting to champion a position, but it's worthwhile to realize everyone's coming from a different place. And I know I make mistakes all the time. And in that acknowledgement of the fact that I can say something and come across in a way that I didn't intend, just that pause allows me to do two things. And this was learned over time. Number one, make sure that at the end of whatever set of comments transpire, that there is a feeling of cohesiveness and that, a non-racist or non-offensive aura is not still lingering to the extent that I can. That's not completely up to me. And then number two, to absolutely make a note to follow up with the person who may not have felt heard or who may have transgressed, in my opinion. I defer to others. I have not yet been in a situation at Stony Brook. I was at my prior institution at Chico State, but not yet at Stony Brook in 12 years, where there was a really untoward confrontation in the classroom that didn't resolve.
Okay. Anyone else?
Also, one of the things I do in my classes, for those students who are reluctant to speak out because they may not have been trained in the tradition of expressing their ideas, I give them opinion papers to write on very specific issues that are very salient in the topics that we are addressing in the classroom. So therefore, there are ways of analyzing the issues that we are discussing in the classroom. In all safety, quote unquote, they can put the ideas on paper. And I tell them that they can write whatever they want. I'm not gonna be offended by what they write or what they write. I just want them to think. I may disagree with them, but that's not the point. The point is I encourage them to know that they have ideas, they have positions on the issues, and they should never be afraid, especially in a free and democratic society, to express their ideas freely without being afraid that there will be repercussions. And I told them that no repercussions will come from me. And in my syllabus, I put a nota bene in all my syllabus, in all my syllabi, alerting them to the fact that they may hear things that are not comfortable to hear in the classroom. They may hear other students say things that may make them uncomfortable. And I do not support anybody attacking anybody, condemning anybody, blaming anybody for whatever. We need to respect people's opinions. We need to value what they have to say. We can challenge them, we can question them, but we should not have animosity towards those individuals when they express their thoughts and ideas.
Okay. Well, what about this question about facts over fiction? Because I think you can start there, right? And if there is any consternation, it comes down to truth telling. Laurie, would you be willing to chime in here?
Sure, I'll chime in what I can. I think the fact that in my classes, there's a lot of emphasis placed on sources, evidence, as in a lot of other disciplines as well. But for historians, I mean, citing your sources is always part of creating your argument and building it well and building a case to persuade others. And so as much as I can, I try to always bring opinions back to, okay, well, how do we get to that point from the sources you're looking at, or what are you referencing, or what are you drawing upon? I still really have the strong belief that we need to take some moments, if not entire sessions, about looking at how the media we ingest on a daily basis, social media, has now converged with history and a lot of other disciplines that, become truths or facts taken for granted, or memes that get passed around really quickly. I mean, the faster pace at which knowledge and statements can be disseminated, I think it's a reality of our time, but it's also something that needs to get taken apart. And even looking at web addresses of certain things, looking at where someone's footnotes come from, looking at what's in Wikipedia entries, for instance. It's like these daily pervasive sources of our opinions and where we get our information from. And some of that information comes from anecdotal sources, our own families, narratives that, are old and passed down. So I think in my classes, I haven't experienced yet conflict between particular people, but it's more like pushing people to delve deeper into, okay, but where does that idea come from, or where are you drawing upon, or whom are you drawing upon when you talk about a certain group of people, and specify, who are we referencing? That's the tactic I've used, and also allowing the class to have breaks, to have silences, to be able to take the time during those breaks to talk with students who you observe might be feeling troubled, disturbed, might be feeling frustrated that they can't articulate themselves to the point that they want to. I think building in that time for you as an instructor to step back and sort of try to take care of things that you might be looking at quietly, but that you might not want to say in front of everybody, I think is important too, pedagogically.
Thank you. What about the professors, the instructors, graduate student, teaching assistants? What about, does the institution have a responsibility to protect or create language that acknowledges the vulnerability of those of us who teach on race and critical race theory? Are there any safeguards for us? Should there be safeguards for us?
I think there should be. I think the university needs to realize that professors who are minorities often do a lot of this education and are called upon to do it in public forums and so forth, to teach others, about what, what's the difference between Asian studies and Asian American studies? What are special issues involved in teaching, the immigrant experience? And it's a great burden because it takes away from research that you might otherwise be doing, and it needs to be counted in issues like promotion and tenure. I think it's undervalued. There's a question in the chat by Joseph, and it's about how do you sustain yourself? When you do this kind of work, it's extremely exhausting. It's not just like going in and teaching an ordinary class where you can do a nice, clever presentation and people are happy and you go home, but emotionally, you may not be able to sleep for hours, after you've taught these intensive courses. And so the question was, how do you sustain yourself? And I don't have any simple answers, but one of the things that I tried to do when I was doing this was to invite artists and academics and activists who I can network with. And because a lot of doing this work is not just intellectual, it's learning how to perform your identity in a different way and teaching students how to do this. So I try to get students mentored and doing events in the Wang Center with people who were dancers and activists, and that they would kind of catch the energy and feel that they themselves can do some of this work. It's very hard work, and I think it's very undervalued. We spent over a decade doing teaching an Asian American history course, which never counted towards promotion or tenure, but it was one of the most rewarding experiences that I had, because I learned so much from the people that came through the Wang Center. People like I interviewed Yuri Kochiyama, who held Malcolm X's head in the famous photograph, the Martin Luther King of the Asian American movement, who was involved in all of the constitutional issues. One of the lawyers who brought the Korematsu case, the Coram Nobis case, to the Supreme Court. And just by being around some of these loving people like Lonnie Ding, who got an honorary doctorate from Stony Brook in 2005, these people are so powerful in being able to change people. You hang around those kind of people and you'll learn things that you'll never learn from just reading their research and their papers.
Thank you
Can
so
I just
much.
add very quickly, I have seen myself make certain points and then those points replicated when I've been observing classes by people of color, and noticing that when I made the point, it was better received. And that is not because I'm a better teacher. That was because the other person making the point was laboring under an additional handicap. And in particular, one point that I was able to make and tie it to, public health outcomes was a New England Journal of Medicine article that criticized the Trump administration itself for neglecting public health at the outset of the pandemic. And I saw other colleagues make that point. That showed me that I, just by virtue of showing up, have protections that others don't. So I just emphatically agree with what Lori and Gary just suggested. Absolutely, there needs to be protections. And if it took someone like me to realize that privilege in that moment, for it to become more than just an academic thing, clearly this university needs to respect it as well. But I think we're moving in that direction.
Go ahead, Adrian.
I just wanted to add that it's also important, I of course agree with the comments that my co-panelists have also highlighted, but I think that if the university does need very clear guidelines, if there are threats of violence or security issues for faculty of color, because unfortunately, given the climate that we're in, sometimes those threats actually do come through, and it's important that the institution does provide that backing, that they've got clear policies, that people are aware of them, just so if someone is dealing with a threat, that they don't feel like they're isolated or alone, or that the onus is on them, to then contact whatever authorities they deem appropriate. So that's definitely something I think that we should certainly champion within the institution, additional protections. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question here about someone who's going to enter into can't find it now, but the conservative arena of public school, and wants some advice on how they can disrupt or circumvent these rigid curriculums to foster critical thinking.
May I answer this question?
Yes.
All right. I mentioned in my presentation that public schools are, for the most part, very conservative institutions. Their goal is to train standardized citizenry through what we call manufacturing consent. That means to say that the guidelines set by the public schools for both teachers and students to follow are clearly delineated. But again, I have to go back to Dewey. What Dewey tells us in situations like this? He said to us, don't be the front person trying to challenge the system, because it won't work. It won't work from the perspective of the students. It won't work from the perspective of the parents. It won't work from the perspective of the administrators. One of the strategies that he proposed, what we call cooperative learning strategies, putting students in groups and assign them a particular research area that they have to do research on their own, and they have to do it systematically, and to present the research findings to the classroom itself. That way, the students are protected, the teachers themselves are protected, and there is nothing administration can say to you, and I'm talking about public schools here, I'm not talking about universities. Nothing they can say to you when you take this particular approach of cooperative learning and assigning projects to your students, instead of you standing in front of them trying to debunk all the lies and the misinformations that exist not only in the textbooks, but in the curriculum itself. So cooperative learning strategies, research projects are the best approach to avoid any negative repercussions coming from administrations and the parents themselves, because the students are doing the research, not you, and you're not telling them anything. They are finding out the truth on their own.
Thank you, George. As I said at the beginning, when we opened, this is the first of a series of conversations. And so in the interest of time, I want to be mindful of everybody's schedule. So if we could just get a last word from each of our panelists. And I promise for those of you who want to ask more questions, we'll allow you to get a question or two more in to the conversation. But if our panelists could give some final words of advice for especially for any graduate students or more junior faculty who are here with us today that really need some help. We're only week 2, 14 weeks to go, but that's a long time. So I think it'd be really constructive if we could give some parting words of advice.
I'm being flooded with thoughts. I guess I just say, take chances in deference to what you believe, but not in a way where you lose sight of the fact that you have colleagues and students in a community of people who will support you. It would not be good, in my view, to be sort of trapped into internalizing a negative experience. If something, this is sort of a version of if you see something, say something, but it's more like if something is going on in your class that doesn't feel right, that seems to insinuate, a non-diverse ethos, don't leave it unaddressed. But don't, if you don't feel comfortable addressing it alone, talk it through with others. This is really a comment about my colleagues at Stony Brook and students at Stony Brook, who I have found to be just surprisingly and overwhelmingly supportive.
Thank you.
I would add to that, sort of on the theme of alliance and backing up and supporting each other. There are options for grad students and instructors in more vulnerable positions to ask for supporters in unexpected places. So you are entitled to ask to be backed up by somebody who isn't just your primary advisor or someone in your field of specialty. You are entitled to ask for the department chair support, other people's support along different lines of generation, of gender, of racial background. And if you feel anxious or at all hesitant about asking for that support directly, I would seek out people who can go with you and speak to back you up and on your behalf, because I think this culture of alliance and support needs to happen at every level. And it's not just institutionally, words are okay, action means more, and going down the line to fostering departmental cultures that make people feel protected when they're teaching in the classroom. So anything from asking someone to come observe your class and see what's going on to having more direct mentorship programs instituted in your department or in your community. I mean, these are things that can take time, but I have seen a lot of it start in my department and elsewhere with the honest conversations between students and professors. So I would just say look for and ask for alliance in unexpected ways.
Thank you so much. And it doesn't actually have to come from your own department too, by the way. Thank you.
May I say?
Yep.
I think finding a supportive community in other departments is a very good thing. Also seeking out mentors in the field. Like go and find like the best people in the field and let them mentor you. I did that with Lonnie Ding, and when she finally accepted her honorary doctorate in 2005, it was one of the most wonderful experiences I had, because we were talking on the phone. She said, I never got my PhD, and it's hard for me to get the NEH grants now because I don't have it. But she had done more to create the field and to change the world. Her films were shown in Congress and to pass the 1980 Civil Liberties Act. She'd done all of these things. She never had the PhD. And when she got it at Stony Brook, her 7 minutes were some of the most powerful 7 minutes I've ever heard at a graduation ceremony. And the other thing I would say is that it's not what you say in class, it's what students do that changes their lives. And when you make up projects that are meaningful to them, man, they remember those projects years and years afterwards, after they've forgotten everything you tried to instill.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, I may say myself, know that it is not about you, it's about your students. Also be understanding, be open, be flexible. Many faculty members are not flexible dealing with those students. They refuse to understand the predicament of the students. And many of these faculty members have a lot of problems with those students. In other words, some people may try to take advantage of you. I know it, but so be it. I'd rather err on the side of one student to take advantage of me than 20 students that I help, that I assist. And I think that most of our students are really decent, very understanding people. When they sense that you're on their side, when they sense that you're not there to oppress them, they really cooperate with you, they really work with you, all right? And I would advise any new faculty members to consider this, that it is not about you, it's about them. And I think if you take that approach, if you make your students understand they can rely on you, they can trust you, you'll have a wonderful time in the classroom. Thank you.
I'll just say everyone's given excellent advice, especially about approaching students, about networking. And so my parting comment will just be to focus on self-care, because we are, as faculty, very important resources. We're teaching material that can be emotionally and intellectually taxing, especially to translate into lectures and activities for our courses. And so thinking through what kind of replenishes you a bit is important, and then utilizing that right throughout the semester. Because if you burn yourself out, or you don't also kind of find some ways to try and protect your time, then you aren't able to provide what you would normally give to the students, and everyone kind of loses in that scenario. So think about self-care seriously as a part of your work around teaching with CRT as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Before the audience runs off, there are some resources that we put in the chat. There's a link to some articles, so you can feel free to check those out. I want to thank our panelists today. If you can put a thumbs up or turn your mics on and applaud. but I'd like to acknowledge our faculty for their words of wisdom, brilliant words of wisdom. I took lots of notes as well. So thank you to Adryan, and thank you to Adrian for helping to make this happen. This again is the first of many conversations, and hopefully the institution, maybe the dean or the provost, will be willing to host another event with another moderator and different panelists. Thank you all. Good night.